In the kitchen, illuminated by the blue of the tiles, a girl with a broom in her hand tried to hold back tears. In front of her, the stepmother, dressed in intense red, raised her accusing finger while her own children ate calmly at the table full of delicacies. But what nobody expected was that among those same children would arise a voice that would change everything. From the door, Esteban remained motionless, observing a scene that would soon put into question not only his authority, but also the true meaning of being a family. What city are you watching this video from, and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. And before we continue, let me wish you health and peace. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? In the grand house in Charleston, while the city blooms with thousands of azaleas, a girl sweeps the floor with trembling hands. The laughter of other children mixes with the dry sound of the broom. Nothing seems to announce that this girl, treated as invisible, will soon be the center of an unexpected change. The spring sun poured through the open balconies, tinting the walls covered with tiles golden. The aroma of magnolia that flooded the entire city in those festive days barely managed to soften the tense air of the main living room. Outside, the neighbors were already preparing their porches for the grand celebration, hanging planters overflowing with azaleas and geraniums. Inside, the atmosphere was quite different. Solemnity and coldness reigned between those walls. Inez, only 10 years old, wore a simple dress worn by washings. The rough fabric brushed her knees while she wielded the broom as if it were too great a weight. Each movement was slow but meticulous. She knew any oversight would be reprimanded with severity. Her fingers, still stained with soap, gripped the wooden handle while she tried not to leave a single speck of dust. Seated in a high-backed armchair, Mrs. Beatrice watched her with a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. She wore an intense red dress that contrasted with the girl's paleness. In her hands rested an embroidered fan that she opened and closed with a nervous snap, marking the rhythm of humiliation. Around her, the room gleamed with wealth. Plush rugs, wrought iron lamps, and a large family portrait where Esteban, the owner of the house, appeared with a serious expression. On one side, Rodrigo and Marisol enjoyed a plate of donuts freshly brought from the downtown bakery. Powdered sugar fell on their fingers, and the aroma of hot chocolate filled the room. Rodrigo, barely 12 years old but already an imitator of his mother's gestures, looked at his stepsister and smiled with irony. "Look how Cinderella sweeps," he exclaimed, letting a bit of sugar deliberately fall onto the freshly cleaned floor. Marisol, 8 years old, laughed nervously. Her laugh was more an echo of her mother's voice than her own mockery. She glanced sideways at her brother, and then at Inez with a mixture of discomfort and obedience. Inez lowered her head and continued sweeping. She didn't respond. From her lips escaped a barely audible murmur, her deceased mother's name. It was her way of protecting herself, of holding an invisible thread with the only memory that made her feel loved. Mrs. Beatrice snapped the fan, stood up with a brusque movement, and advanced toward the girl. Her heels resonated on the tiles, each step harder than the previous one. She stopped in front of Inez, lifted her chin with a cold finger, and pronounced with a cutting voice, "Here you are nothing, Inez. You have your place." The silence that followed was heavy. On the street, the murmur of tourists and the clatter of horse-drawn carriages filled the Charleston afternoon, but inside the living room, only the girl's contained breathing could be heard. Rodrigo, despite his earlier joke, looked away uncomfortably. Marisol hugged her cup of chocolate without daring to say a word. Inez felt her throat close. The sweet aroma of the donuts reminded her how far she was from sharing those small joys. She gripped the broom so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to speak, but the words died in her mouth. Mrs. Beatrice returned to her armchair with a triumphant air, satisfied at having reaffirmed the order she herself had imposed in the house. Rodrigo tried to resume his laughter, but it no longer sounded the same. Marisol, for her part, didn't stop looking at Inez, with wide eyes full of questions she didn't dare formulate. The girl, in silence, bent down again to pick up some fallen sugar crumbs. Each of her gestures seemed an act of hidden dignity. Even when reduced to a servant in her own home, she kept her head high in her heart. From the half-open living room door, a shadow stopped for an instant. Attentive eyes followed every detail of the scene. Nobody inside the room noticed, but someone had seen how little Inez, with her broom and her silence, endured the humiliation. Night fell slowly over Charleston, and the tolling of the church bells extended like a sigh over the city. Inside the kitchen, the family prepared for dinner. The air smelled of fried peppers and olive oil, a homey aroma that contrasted with the injustice that was about to unfold at the table. The table was wide, of dark wood, with embroidered tablecloths and glazed ceramic plates. On it rested bowls of gazpacho, a platter of golden empanadas and freshly baked bread. Inez's eyes shone as she contemplated the food, but in front of her there was only an empty plate. She sat in silence with her hands on her lap, trying to disguise the hunger that roared in her stomach. Mrs. Beatriz served generous portions to Rodrigo and Marisol, caressing their heads with an affectionate gesture. Then she glanced sideways at Inez and with a dry tone said, "The girl already ate earlier, don't you see? She doesn't need more." Rodrigo bit a piece of empanada, but the smile was erased when he noticed how Inez lowered her gaze. The girl observed the tablecloth with exaggerated attention, as if she could disappear into the embroidery. Her lips trembled and a silent tear fell onto the fabric. Marisol ate distractedly, following her mother's example, though her restless eyes rested from time to time on Inez. There was something in that silence that made her uncomfortable, but she still didn't dare say anything. Rodrigo, on the other hand, felt a knot in his throat. He remembered the afternoon's mockery, and how Inez had lowered her head without protesting. That same image repeated now, with the difference that tears shone in the light of the wrought iron lamp. Shame mixed with a new impulse, the need to do something. He waited for his mother to get up to bring a pitcher of water. Then, discreetly, he broke off a piece of empanada and slid it under the table. His foot gently pushed the piece to where Inez kept her hands together. The girl felt it, hesitated an instant, and then picked it up with trembling fingers. She looked up surprised and met Rodrigo's eyes. He, nervous, leaned toward her and whispered, "Don't say anything." Inez clutched the piece of empanada as if it were a treasure. The warm flavor filled her mouth and returned to her. Even if just for a few seconds, the sensation of belonging to that home that had so often denied her a place. In that precise instant, a shadow crossed the window. The reflection of someone passing stopped for a second, as if observing the scene from the street's shadows. Neither Rodrigo nor Inez noticed, but the murmur of footsteps walking away left the sensation they weren't so alone in that shared secret. Beatrice returned with the pitcher and suspected nothing. She sat down again, served water to her children, and resumed trivial conversation about the parades that would soon fill the city. Rodrigo chewed slowly with an accelerated heart. For the first time, he had silently defied his mother's injustice. Marisol, without fully understanding, looked at her older brother with a strange expression, as if sensing something in him was changing. Sunday's sun illuminated the downtown square forcefully. The cafe terraces filled with families. Waiters ran from side to side with trays of glasses and plates of appetizers, and children chased colorful balloons while street musicians played folk songs with worn guitars. It was a festive day, like so many in spring, but not everyone enjoyed it equally. Mrs. Beatrice walked direct through the crowd, greeting acquainted ladies with a smile, showing off her new dress as if parading. At her side, Marisol bit a lollipop her mother had bought her, and Rodrigo devoured a piece of almond cake. Behind them, Inez carried several heavy shopping bags, handmade sweets, bread, fruits, and even a couple of wine bottles for dinner. Her thin arms could barely handle the weight, and each step was an effort. "Walk straight, girl, don't let the bottles fall," Beatrice ordered, without even looking at her. Her tone was as dry as the air blowing over the square. Inez nodded silently. The square's bustle seemed a foreign world. While other children laughed and ran free, she advanced with her head lowered, feeling like a shadow in the midst of the sun. Rodrigo, who walked a few steps ahead, turned his head and saw her stumble on a cobblestone. One of the bags tilted dangerously, and he, almost without thinking, ran toward her. "Be careful," he whispered while holding her load. Inez looked at him surprised, with large, moist eyes, as if she couldn't believe that gesture. Rodrigo cleared his throat and nervously returned to his mother's side. Beatrice frowned upon seeing the scene. "Don't spoil her, Rodrigo. She has to learn to do things alone." He lowered his head, but inside he boiled. It was no longer the first time he saw the injustice, and each time it was harder for him to keep silent. They sat at one of the terraces. The waiter, a middle-aged man with a white apron, brought crystal glasses with refreshments and a plate of seasoned olives. Rodrigo and Marisol settled in enthusiastically while Beatriz took out money to leave a small tip as custom dictated. Inez, however, remained standing next to the table with the bags at her feet, watching in silence as the others enjoyed themselves. Marisol, with her mouth still stained with sugar, leaned toward her mother and asked in a low voice, "Mom, why doesn't Inez ever sit with us?" Beatrice tensed, her smile froze, and after a brief silence answered coldly, "Because she's not like you." Marisol lowered her gaze, confused, while Rodrigo gripped the glass tightly. The square's murmur seemed louder suddenly, as if everyone had heard the phrase, though it had only been a whisper among them. On the way back home, the atmosphere was heavy. Inez walked slowly, tired from the bag's weight. Rodrigo, with determination, approached her, and instead of following his mother, positioned himself at her side. Their steps resonated together on the ancient stones, and for the first time Inez didn't feel completely alone. The silence became uncomfortable. Beatriz, looking back, pressed her lips with disapproval, but Rodrigo no longer seemed willing to back down. Upon arriving at the living room, when Inez left the bags on the table, a loud noise interrupted everything. The sound of breaking glass rumbled through the house. An antique vase, a family heirloom from Esteban's family, lay in pieces on the tiled floor. The echo of broken glass still vibrated in the air, the pieces of the antique vase scattered on the tiled floor, reflecting the afternoon light as if they were glass tears. The living room, until then full of murmurs and tired footsteps, fell silent. Mrs. Beatrice was the first to react. Her eyes opened with fury, and the fan she carried in her hand closed suddenly with a dry snap. She advanced toward the center of the living room, raising her voice so sharply that neighbors on the nearby street could have heard her. "Inez!" she shouted, pointing with an accusing finger. It was her. Always clumsy, always causing problems. The girl remained paralyzed. She looked at the shiny pieces at her feet, and then at the woman accusing her. Her face flushed with shame, and tears threatened to spring from her eyes. She wanted to speak, wanted to say she hadn't touched that vase, that she was only picking up the shopping bags, but her voice remained trapped in her throat. Rodrigo and Marisol observed the scene with shrinking hearts. Rodrigo had seen how Inez walked carefully, how she barely brushed the table where the vase rested. The blow had been the product of a brusque movement by Beatrice herself, who when passing with her purse brushed the pedestal. However, she wasn't planning to admit it. "It wasn't her, Mom," Marisol stammered with a trembling voice. "Silence, girl," Beatrice cut her off. "This house can't always be on the verge of disaster because of an intruder." Inez pressed her hands against her dress, incapable of defending herself. Her heart beat so hard she felt everyone could hear it. She bent toward the pieces, as if by picking up that disaster she could prove her innocence. But each of her gestures was interpreted as proof of guilt. Rodrigo breathed deeply. The memory of the empanada he had shared with her the previous night returned to his mind. He also remembered Inez's grateful look, so pure it had left an impossible-to-ignore mark on him. Now he saw her vulnerable, accused of something she hadn't done, and understood it was the moment to act. "It was me," he said suddenly with a firm voice. The living room trembled. Beatrice turned toward her son, incredulous. "What are you saying, Rodrigo?" "It was me who broke the vase. I stumbled and knocked it over without meaning to." "It wasn't Inez." Marisol opened her eyes wide, surprised, and then lowered her head. Her brother had just confronted their mother, something neither of them had ever done. Beatrice remained frozen for an instant, but soon recovered control. Her face reddened and the veins in her neck marked with tension. "You dare to lie for her?" She spat with rage. "You defend that girl over your mother?" Rodrigo held her gaze. Inside he trembled, but didn't take a step back. "I'm not lying," he repeated. "It was my fault." Marisol, incapable of enduring the tension, burst into tears. She ran toward Inez, hugged her tightly and shouted, "It wasn't her, Mom. Leave her alone." The little girl's crying filled the room, so sincere that for an instant it seemed to silence even the church bells nearby. Beatrice brought a hand to her forehead, exasperated, and stepped back. Her authority, so firm until then, began to crack. In that same moment, the living room door opened with a soft blow. A figure appeared in the threshold. Mr. Esteban had arrived home. His face showed surprise and exhaustion, like someone who returns after a long day and finds an unexpected scene. The silence became even denser. Marisol's tears, Rodrigo's bravery, and Beatrice's accusation mixed in an air charged with tension. Inez, still hugging her little sister, looked up and saw her father at the door and knew everything was about to change. Esteban entered with firm steps, surprised by the tense silence that received him. The door still swayed behind him when his eyes swept the scene. The pieces of the inherited vase scattered on the floor. Rodrigo standing erect like a soldier, Inez hugging Marisol, who cried inconsolably, and Beatrice with her face flushed with rage. "What's happening here?" he asked with a grave voice that resonated on the living room walls. Beatrice stepped forward immediately, as if wanting to take control before anyone spoke. "Your daughter," she pronounced the word with barely disguised venom, "broke your mother's vase. There's no way she'll learn." Rodrigo took a step forward. "It wasn't her, Dad. It was me." Esteban looked at him with disbelief. He knew how to read his son's gestures, and there he saw no lie, but a determination he had never noticed before. "You?" he repeated, confused. "Yes, it was an accident. Mom wants to blame Inez because she always blames her for everything." Beatrice interrupted him, raising her voice. "Enough, Rodrigo. Don't make things up. How dare you defy me in front of your father?" But before she could continue, Marisol, with reddened eyes and a broken voice, clung to Esteban's arm. "Dad, it wasn't Inez. She always suffers because of us. Mom never leaves her in peace." The living room fell silent. Esteban lowered his gaze toward Marisol, who sobbed with her face buried in his jacket sleeve. A fleeting memory pierced him. The sweet smile of his first wife. That woman who had died too soon, and whose face seemed to revive in Inez's moistened eyes. He felt a stab in his chest, a mixture of guilt and tenderness that left him breathless. Mrs. Beatrice tried to regain control. "Esteban, don't listen to the children. They're manipulated by that creature. I've always cared for this house, and now they accuse me as if I were the bad one." He observed her for a long time. For years he had preferred to remain silent, avoid confrontations to maintain a facade of harmony. He had put his work, his businesses, and his travels ahead of everything. But now, seeing his children cry and Inez trembling, he understood the price of his silence. "Enough already," he finally said with a low but firm voice. Beatrice opened her mouth to respond, but Esteban raised his hand and she stopped. Her eyes were fixed on him, disconcerted. She had never seen him yield that way before. Rodrigo, on the other hand, breathed relieved as if finally someone had listened to him. Esteban bent toward Inez, who was still on the floor next to the vase pieces. The girl looked at him with fear, expecting another sentence, but he gently caressed her hair and murmured, "You don't have to be afraid, daughter." Inez blinked, incredulous. Her lips trembled, incapable of articulating a response. Rodrigo approached and put a hand on her shoulder. Marisol, through tears, smiled for the first time all afternoon. Beatrice, on the other hand, stepped back. Her security swayed, and the image of a woman who controlled everything began to crack. Outside, the distant drums of a parade filled the city, marking the solemn rhythm of that moment. The sound of the drums seemed to also pace Esteban's heartbeat, who debated between fury toward his wife and the pain of having allowed so much injustice. He looked again at Inez, and saw in her fragile face the opportunity to repair what he had neglected for years. Mr. Esteban took a step toward Beatrice, and looking her directly in the eyes, repeated with more force, "Enough already." A heavy silence remained suspended in the living room after Esteban's words. Nobody dared move. Beatrice, with the fan still in her hand, looked at her husband as if she didn't recognize him. Rodrigo kept his back straight, determined not to back down. Marisol remained next to Inez, holding her with a hug full of tenderness. Esteban breathed deeply and pointed to the interior patio. "Let's go outside." His tone admitted no discussion. The family went out to the patio, which that afternoon was more luminous than ever. The air brought with it the perfume of jasmine and bougainvillea, typical of the spring celebration. The planters hung on the whitewashed walls, and the distant murmur of the city mixed with the sparrows singing. It was a perfect setting to talk about what truly mattered. Esteban positioned himself in the center under a vine's shade. His gaze swept each of those present. First Rodrigo, who observed him with a mixture of respect and fear. Then Marisol, still with tears on her cheeks. Finally, Inez, who seemed more fragile than ever, as if any word could break her. "I have failed as a father," he said with a trembling but firm voice. "For too long I've hidden in work, in trips, in excuses. I've allowed injustice to reign in this house, but starting today this changes." Inez felt her heart flip. She had never heard her father speak with such clarity. Her hands trembled and she wanted to believe it wasn't a dream. Rodrigo stepped forward and, looking at her, added, "You're not alone, Inez. We're siblings, whether you want it or not." Marisol, with the innocence of her 8 years, lifted the girl's hand and held it high as if proclaiming a truth. "Yes, Dad. She's also part of the family." Beatrice pressed her lips together, incapable of responding. The control she had always exercised was slipping from her hands. She tried to speak, but Esteban's firm gaze stopped her. He was no longer the absent and docile man from before. Now he was a father who had decided to recover his place. "Starting today," he continued, "everyone eats at the same table. Everyone shares this home. And whoever doesn't accept it will remain alone in their bitterness." The echo of those words resonated in the patio. Inez felt something inside her break, but not from pain, but from relief. Tears ran down her cheeks, and without thinking, she threw herself into her father's arms. Esteban held her tightly, as if wanting to recover all at once all the hugs he had denied her. Rodrigo approached and put his hand on both their shoulders. Marisol, between laughter and tears, wrapped Inez around the waist. For the first time, the four formed a united circle, while Beatrice remained apart, without words. The patio air was charged with life. A neighbor leaning from the balcony across threw them a happy Sunday afternoon, as if the entire city celebrated the reconciliation. On the already prepared table, someone had left plates of gazpacho and crusty bread. Esteban made a gesture inviting everyone to sit, and this time, Inez occupied her place next to the others. While tasting the bread, the girl looked around and smiled. The smile was timid but sincere, and shone under the sunset's golden light. Rodrigo and Marisol looked at her with pride, as if they had won a battle. Esteban, for his part, allowed himself to close his eyes for an instant, grateful for the opportunity to repair what was lost. The church bells rang in the distance, mixing with the celebrating city's bustle. Charleston dressed in colors for the spring celebration, and in that flowery patio, a new family was also being born. Sometimes the simplest moments hold the force of a profound transformation. Just imagine that final scene in the Charleston patio. The geraniums hanging on the white walls, the spring breeze caressing the bougainvillea, and a girl who finally found a place at her own family's table. It's not a noisy or spectacular scene, but it is unforgettable, because behind those timid glances and those unexpected hugs is enclosed the real power of reconciliation. Dear listeners, if this story has reached your heart, leave the number 1 in the comments. If you think it could be told differently or add something more, mark with the number 0. What we have heard throughout these chapters is not only the life of Inez, Rodrigo, Marisol, Esteban, and Beatriz. It's also a mirror where many houses, many tables, many silences are reflected. It reminds us that love isn't always expressed with grandiose words, but with simple gestures, a piece of bread shared in secret, a sincere tear that breaks fear, a voice that finally says, "Enough." Each of those actions, so small in appearance, has the capacity to open cracks in the walls of indifference. The lesson is clear and timeless. Unconditional love can change a destiny. Everyone deserves to be loved and be part of a family, and humanity is worth much more than money or social position. When someone receives a second chance, they can shine with an unexpected light, like a humble lamp that guides in darkness. Perhaps more than one of you remembers some gesture of kindness that changed your life, a forgiveness granted in time, or a hug that restored hope. And it's that happiness isn't found in accumulating, but in learning to live for others. That's why this story doesn't end only in Charleston or in a girl's life. It invites us to stop for an instant and think, how many times have we closed our eyes to injustice in our own home or in our environment? How many times have we remained silent for comfort? Esteban needed to see his daughter in tears to awaken, but we can do it earlier, in the everyday, with those we have near. If this story has touched your heart, share it. Talk about it with family. Let it resonate over coffee or in the evening walk through the square. Because in the end, what keeps us united aren't the walls of a house or the objects we keep in it, but the certainty that someone waits for us with open arms. And that image, a girl smiling for the first time next to her family in a patio full of flowers, deserves to stay with us as a reminder that there's always a moment to ask for forgiveness, to offer affection, and to start again.